Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Zach Parrish. I'm the Bexley Public Library programming librarian here. So if you didn't know, November is Native American Heritage Month. So thank you all for coming out and celebrating that tonight. We're hoping to be joined by two professors, but I'll introduce our first presenter here. We are very lucky and honored to be joined by Dr. Brad Lepper, who is the Curator of Archaeology at the Ohio History Connection. He earned his BA degree from the University of New Mexico and his MA and PhD degrees from The Ohio State University. His primary areas of interest include the Ice Age peoples of North America, Ohio's magnificent mounds and earthworks, and the history of North American archaeology. Dr. Lepper has written extensively on these subjects for both technical journals and magazines intended for a general audience. He is the author of the book Ohio Archaeology, an illustrated chronicle of Ohio's ancient American Indian cultures, published in 2005. He also writes a monthly column on archaeology for the Columbus Dispatch. And we also are lucky to be joined by Dr. John Lau, who is the director of the OSU Newark Earthworks Center and an enrolled citizen of the Pokagon band of the Potawatomi Indians. He received his PhD in American culture at the University of Michigan. Professor Lau previously served as executive director at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian in Evanston, Illinois, and served as a member of the advisory committee for the Indians of the Midwest Project at the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. So please welcome Dr. Brad Lepper and Dr. John Lau.
Good to see you, John. This is a water for you. I'll put it over here. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm very glad you could all be here tonight. I'm very pleased to be here with John. It's always a pleasure to have an archaeologist and an Indigenous person present together to give you different perspectives and to show you that they can be very complementary. I don't have so much as a PowerPoint presentation, but I guess I do. It's some slides that I want us to talk about a little bit and reflect on that relate to the Newark Earthworks as well as the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, the UNESCO World Heritage Site that just became like Ohio's first World Heritage Site just last year. And the Newark Earthworks, the two sites that are part of the Newark Earthworks, are a part of that nomination. And I'll illustrate some of that with some slides, and John can make comments as he wishes. And so these are the 8 sites, or I guess it's the 8 components of what is the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Newark Earthworks are special because they're the northernmost component, and there's 2 sites there that we'll talk about, the Great Circle and the Octagon Earthworks. They were once part of the whole Newark Earthworks, but since they're separate sites now, we consider them somewhat separately. And then there's the Fort Ancient Earthworks down in Warren County. And together, those 3 sites are owned and managed by the Ohio History Connection. The other 5 sites that make up the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks are the sites that are part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. So these are managed by the National Park Service. But together, they tell one big story. They're like chapters of the story of this ancient indigenous culture that lived here between about AD 1 or maybe as early as 100 BC to AD 400. So this is one of the early maps of the Newark Earthworks. It's one of the best maps that we have from this time period. It was published in it wasn't published, it was submitted to the American Antiquarian Society in Boston for consideration for publication in 1862. It was never published. They reviewed it. It had a bunch of an article that went with it, and they approved it for publication, but their publication budget was insufficient that year, and the next year, and the next year, and then they just forgot about it. But this is the entire Newark Earthworks complex, 4.5 square miles, by a conservative estimate, 7 million cubic feet of earth used to construct it. And the technology that they used to construct it was as simple as you can imagine: pointed sticks, clamshell hose, and baskets. And they dug up the earth, filled the baskets, and carried them one at a time. Must have been thousands and thousands of basket loads. And the amount of effort and the number of people that must have been involved in this project are immense. And what's very surprising about that is this isn't a city where thousands of people lived. This was entirely a ceremonial center, and the people that built it lived in really tiny communities that are so small, archaeologists don't even call them villages. We call them hamlets, but you can think of them as homesteads with just a couple of families, their garden where they're growing plants like squash and sunflower and goosefoot, little barley, and they're hunting, fishing, and gathering. But hundreds, thousands of those communities must have come together here. So this is the Octagon Earthworks, and this is the Great Circle. These are the only two components of the Newark Earthworks that you can see today. There is a small corner of the square that's called the Wright Earthworks. It's on like a half an acre, and it's got a freeway on one side and a welding plant on the other side. So it's not a great visitor experience. And so we didn't include it in the World Heritage nomination. These are the two World Heritage Sites that represent Newark. But that is a really important site if you're sort of an archaeologist and want to have an anchor to know exactly where that square was. Because what this looks like now is that. I mean, it's the city of Newark with the Octagon up here looking suspiciously like a golf course, which it is and will be until January 1st. And then here's the Great Circle, which is a wonderful place to visit and get a sense of the grandeur of this architecture. So there's these two sites. We can, when we get to the question and answer period, and you want to ask more questions maybe about the other Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, we can talk about those too. But I think we're going to be focused on Newark. This is where John and I both work and live. And so these places, they certainly have a special place in my heart, and I know they have a special place in John's too. Do you want to add anything before we go on to the next slide?
Well, first, thank you for coming. I appreciate that very much. Very honored to be on the stage with Brad.
As am I, to be on the stage with John.
There you go. And I oftentimes start off my talks with a language lesson. So I'm Potawatomi, Pokagon, Potawatomi. And so we're going to learn a word. Is that okay? Okay. We'll learn how to say hello. Bonjour. Bonjour. Very good. They've passed.
Terrific. This is a different map of the Newark Earthworks. It's more iconic. And this one was actually published. And it was published in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. So it really emphasizes the fact that the Newark Earthworks and the related earthworks they're not just sort of at the heart of the birth of archaeology in Ohio or even archaeology in the nation. I mean, it's a national thing. It's like we're right there at the birth of science. This was one of the first big scientific problems that the Smithsonian Institution was addressing. Who were the builders of the mound builders? It shouldn't have been a question. It should have been perfectly obvious, and it was to many people, that they were built by the ancestors of the indigenous people of this region. But lots of people, for lots of reasons, some political, it was inconvenient to have indigenous Americans connected with such sophisticated architecture. And these things where everybody was amazed with these. Oh, where did they come from? Who built them? Well, it couldn't be the savage Indians. It had to have been some civilized race of white people that the Indians came in and exterminated. I mean, this was literally what they were trying to justify. But the Smithsonian contributed towards the effort to point out that they were built by the indigenous American Indians, but it wasn't like proven to the scientific community until like the 1890s when Cyrus Thomas published a Bureau of American Ethnology bulletin about the mound builders, a huge multi-year long study that they said, Gosh, these were built by the ancestors of American Indians. Who knew? One thing about the scale, because if you've never been to the Newark Earthworks, I've got some examples of other World Heritage Sites here. And the Roman Colosseum, you could fit 4 of them inside the octagon by itself. The Great Circle would have fit comfortably inside the square, or this is the Great Circle. The Great Pyramid of Egypt would have fit comfortably inside the square. And Stonehenge, a magnificent monument, would fit inside that small circle, which of course is only small because it's next to this gigantic octagon. So it's a huge, immense site. The architecture is on a scale that's comparable to anything that's being built anywhere else in the ancient world at this time. And I think the surprising thing, though, is that in this case, I think as I already mentioned, it was not built by what sort of archaeologists, anthropologists have traditionally called a civilization, although we certainly think the people were civilized. So a civilization, when we teach this to undergraduates, it's got a bunch of criteria. They lived in cities. That's at the very root of the word civilization. They had kings or pharaohs or queens ruling them. It was a sort of a hierarchically structured society with a king at the top or a pharaoh or a queen, and then nobles, and then different strata of society as you go down to the bottom where you've got slaves and common people. And it had a system of writing, and they had armies, and they had all kinds of things. I think there's 7 or 8 characteristics. The Hopewell, the ancient indigenous Hopewell culture, had monumental architecture, but none of those other characteristics. These little communities came together here voluntarily to construct these earthworks and then later to worship at them. And there was no compulsion. There was no sort of dictator telling them what to do. It was a remarkable era in world history that you have all these people working together for a common purpose, building what maybe they thought of as some kind of highway to heaven with the Creator. And John will have more to say about that, what he thinks these things related to. And I mentioned the technology as being simple, but the knowledge that's encoded in these are anything but simple. In fact, let me go back to, gets into the astronomy. Just briefly, some of the geometry. The circumference of the Great Circle, I don't know what the circumference is, I can't remember that number, but it's 1,200 feet in diameter, which is 4 American football fields. But the circumference of that circle is equal to the perimeter of that perfect square. So in addition to all being connected by these ceremonial avenues that would have choreographed the movement of people through these spaces, in addition to that literal connection, there's this hidden geometrical connection between these 2 earthworks. Well, what about the rest? It turns out, this is even more sophisticated geometry, the area of that square is equal to the area of this perfect circle. And that's like squaring the circle kinds of stuff that the Pythagoreans and stuff in Greece were working with that and struggling with that issue. These people were too. And then there's the octagon, which I mentioned is already so massive. How does that have any kind of geometric connection? And it does, but it's even deeper. Because if you draw a square inside the octagon, and this is probably how they laid it out at first, from alternate corners, the sides of that square are equal to the diameter of that circle, and the area of that hidden square is equal to the area of the Great Circle. So, amazing geometry, and that's just sort of on the surface. This diameter, it's 1,054 feet in diameter, so it's slightly smaller than the Great Circle. Maybe some of you have been to Circleville for maybe the Pumpkin Festival. It's called Circleville because it had 2 circles built by this civilization, a large one and a smaller one inside it connected to a square. The large circle was 1,200 feet in diameter. The small circle was 1,054 feet in diameter. So they have a common unit of measure. They have a system of surveying where they can lay these things out to the same size in different places. John, did you want to say something?
Sure. No, that's really helpful. We think of this as a STEM facility, right? Science, technology, engineering, math. probably also architecture and art, so a STEAM facility. At Newark, where I teach, we recently, the last dean, we built a $6 million STEM building, attracting a lot of students and a lot of interest. And I did tell the dean, well, Bill, we already have a STEM facility. It's the Octagon. And he looked at me and rolled his eyes like he usually does, right? So, but nonetheless, a place of knowledge reflects knowledge, perhaps a place of teaching knowledge, transmission of knowledge. And I just want to mention one other thing at this point is I teach, and I have students ask me questions all the time, or comments. And one of the things they mention is that, well, I know about the golf course, and I know about the Great Circle. I see it on when I drive down to Indian Mound Mall. And they say, but it'd be more impressive if it was tall. And, you know, like the Giza Pyramid, which the Octagon, I believe I'm correct that if it's tipped on its side, is as tall as the Giza Pyramid.
Probably.
Yeah, and so, you know, the magnitude of the construction, the magnitude of the vision, the magnitude of that egalitarian effort, that consensual community effort is really incredible. We could have built things high. Lots of people around the world do, but we, and I say we because my ancestors may have contributed to the building of this, certainly some of their DNA runs through me, we use the most sacred material to us, earth, to build them, not stone, which, you know, a lot of these around the world, stone is the primary thing for construction. Why didn't we use stone? Well, stone is nice. We understand stones as our grandfathers. They're alive, they have a spirit. But we used earth because that's the most sacred material. We call it Nok Muskiganon, grandmother earth. And we have a predilection in Western society towards dirt. You know, that, oh, they made it of dirt. Well, dirt. Wipe your dirty feet, wash your dirty hands, wash your dirty mouth. At least that's how my mom talked. But they were using the most sacred material available to them. And as Brad said, basket after basket after basket, loading up that sacred material to inscribe these places on the landscape. And so the other thing I wanted to mention is, so they're horizontal, not vertical, but we beat Frank Lloyd Wright by 2,000 years, right? He's a genius architect. I love him. How many love Frank Lloyd Wright? Everybody. Who can't, you know, so, but he was building to embrace the landscape, right? And so we were doing the same thing. We were embracing the landscape. It wasn't all about height. It was about magnitude and creating spaces of, for all sorts of activities that we'll get to in a little bit, I'm sure.
Could you reflect on the shapes, John, the circles, the shape, what significance would they have for you?
Sure. A lot of this, I'm an ethnohistorian, which means we don't have written records about these places, but we can speculate from what's going on today among Native peoples and think about, well, if we upstream it, what seems to make sense? That's sort of one of the methodologies of ethnohistory, right? So the Great Circle, to me, it reflects the four cardinal directions. That's not so incredible, but it's cool that they did that. You know, east, where the sun rises, east where the sun rises, south, summer, midlife, west, black, darkness, when life ends, and then north, the white, the purity, where our souls go on their journey to the Milky Way and on to our heaven. And so it's reflecting those 4 directions. And 4 is a very important number with a lot of tribes throughout North America. But it has 3 more directions. And as luck would have it, 7. 4 plus 3 equals 7. That's also a sacred number among many Indian tribes. And where are the other 3 directions reflected in the Great Circle? There's the above, the sky world, that we're taught that we're a part of that the stars are other tribal nations' campfires, that the Milky Way is, we can see the souls of our ancestors traversing that. And the beneath, there's a moat around here that may have reflected the underworld. And we didn't have a sense of hell, like a place of damnation, but it was a place where spirits dwelled, and that we should acknowledge and honor those spirits, and also the present, right here. So, and reminding us perhaps to be mindful of where we are at right here. So it's 4 and 7. And the octagon, similar circle, and then here, and the octagon itself has places for entry. There's these sort of metaphorical built impediments. We don't know what those were used for, whether they were to keep bad energy out, whether it was to divide, this clan goes to the right, that clan goes to the left, or gendered, men this side, women that side. But there was some conscious idea of use and flow of traffic and maintaining the spirit nature of it. And we'll talk about more, I'm sure, about the alignments, the astronomical aspects of it. But I remember when I first got hired here about 12 years ago, the Pokagon elders came down on one of their bus trips. And I wasn't quite so much an elder then, but they came down and they wanted to see, why is John left home and why is he in central Ohio? What can be so important about that? And so we showed them the octagon and the great circle, and I was bemoaning the fact that there's a golf course on this. And Majel, who I love and respect very much, she took me aside and she said, "You're not understanding it. You don't get it." My mother failed somehow in teaching me how to look at this. She said, it's not desecrated by the golf course. It's not desecrated by, it didn't become unholy or unspiritual. In fact, these places didn't make it sacred. They were already sacred. They were created sacred by the Creator. They'll always be sacred. Humans, we shouldn't have the hubris that we can, well, in the Western world, right, we erect a church, consecrate it, use it, and when it's no longer needed, we deconstruct it or deconsecrate it, and it's like somebody's home or a microbrewery or a restaurant or an antique shop or whatever, right? Majel said, these places will always be sacred. We just built upon them to celebrate that sacredness.
I want to go back to John's point about this being sort of the original STEM center. The octagon and the circle, the observatory circle that's connected to it, this is the Observatory Mound. It's on the one side of the circle. Oddly enough, it's been called Observatory Mound for more than like 150 years. Originally, it was called that because it's about twice as high as the rest of the earthworks. So if you stand on it, you get a good observation view of the earthworks. But it now has a very different significance for many of us because of the work of two scholars from Earlham College in Indiana, Dr. Ray Hively, a physicist and astronomer, and Dr. Robert Horn, a philosopher. They were team teaching a class at Earlham, and this was late 70s, very, very early 80s, about the time Gerald Hawkins had come out with a book called Stonehenge Decoded, which proposed that Stonehenge was an elaborate astronomical computer and aligned to the solstice and the equinox and so on. And Ray Hively and Robert Horn didn't believe that. They said, oh, these ancient people, whether they're in Europe or America, they weren't paying that much attention to the sky, they weren't that smart. It's just a coincidence, because Stonehenge is a very complicated monument. It has lots of openings. You can draw like dozens of lines through it. So just by happenstance, some of those lines will point to a solstice or an equinox. And it's not because they designed it that way. It's just complicated. So if you put Stonehenge on a roulette wheel and spin it 999 times out of 1,000, you'll be able to find one of these or more than one of these alignments. So as part of their class they were team teaching, they wanted to include this concept as a critical thinking exercise. Well, they couldn't take their students to Stonehenge, but Bob Horn had been to the Octagon. And he'd seen, oh, look at this, the walls and the openings, you can draw lots of lines there. Let's go there, draw a bunch of lines, show the students, oh, look, there's a summer solstice alignment, or there's an equinox alignment. You see, it's just accidental. It's not that these people were that smart. And this is critical, because they come to this site to try to prove that ancient people weren't all that smart. So they go here and draw all those lines, and there's not a single solar alignment. And they said that really bothered them, because that's statistically significant. Why did they build it intentionally to avoid any solar alignments? That seems silly. But then they said, well, maybe it's not aligned to the sun because it's aligned to something else. Well, what else is up there? The moon. And it turns out, I don't know about John, but before I got into this, I didn't know there was a lunar cycle. I mean, I knew about the phases of the moon, but the moon just seemed to be erratic. Sometimes it's over here, sometimes it's over here, sometimes it's out during the day. You know, what's that all about? So I never noticed any kind of rhythm. Well, the ancient indigenous people that lived here certainly did, because the moon has a cycle that's very much like the sun. So the sun has a northernmost point, or a rise point on the eastern horizon, and that's the summer solstice. Never rises any further to the north. 6 months later, it's got a southernmost rise point, and that's the winter solstice, and in the middle is the equinox. So it's a cycle, a yearly cycle, and it's a cycle that we all just understand almost intuitively, because it's the seasons. Turns out the moon does the same thing, but it does it every month, or every 28 and a third day, or something like that. But it has a northernmost rise of the moon, and 2 weeks later, it has a southernmost rise of the moon, and 2 weeks later, it's back where it started. But that angle changes from month to month over an 18.6 year-long cycle. So at one end of the cycle, you have the absolute northernmost rise of the moon, and 2 weeks later, you have the absolute northernmost rise of the moon. And then 2 weeks later, it's back where it started. And then the next month, that angle contracts. And the next month, it contracts some more. 9.3 years later, the northernmost rise of the moon for that month is at its absolute southernmost point. And the southernmost rise for that month is at its northernmost point. And then the next month, the angle starts widening again, and 18.6 years later, you're back here. Hively and Horn determined that the Octagon earthworks is aligned to the northernmost rise of the moon. And if you stand in this gateway and sight right along that wall, that's the southernmost rise of the moon. And I think I've got this on the next slide. All 8 of the key lunar rise and set points that define the lunar cycle are built into the circle and octagon. And this is what it actually looks like with the moon rising in alignment with the northernmost rise right along the axis of the octagon. And we got to see that 18.59 years ago. So we're very close now to the northernmost rise of the moon coming up. But so Hopewell and Horn, they're astonished. They think this is amazing. So they take their results to who was then the foremost Hopewell archaeologist in Ohio at Kent State University. And they presented their results to him. And as they tell me the story, he chuckled and said, no, you're confused. You have to understand, these people were savages. They didn't know that sort of thing. And Hopewell and Horn were like, oh, well, if archaeologists don't think we're onto anything, well, what the heck? But they said, we're going to do one more thing. They went down to the other circle and octagon, the High Bank Works that was built, that's also part of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks World Heritage Site. That circle is identical in size to Newark Circle. The octagon is a little bit smaller. And the axis of that site is exactly 90 degrees oriented to this one, even though it's 60 miles away. And it also has all 8 of the lunar rise points built into it. So it's not a coincidence. It's these people were focused on the moon at this place. Many other sites, they do line up to the summer solstice or the equinox. Hopewell and Horn just happened to pick one that was devoted almost entirely, or entirely for that matter, to the moon. Do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Well, one is I find that an amazing example of the oral transmission of knowledge, right? If you think about it, and I'm the same way, Brad, that I didn't pay too much attention to the moon. We didn't, I grew up in Southwest Michigan in the Pokagon Potawatomi community. We have stories about the moon and stories about the sun, stories about the sky and the planets and the stars, but we didn't have anything that tracked that movement up and down the horizon. We didn't have stories, but so they noticed it after 18.6 years. Somebody had to notice it for the first time and perhaps noticed it a second time. And if they were lucky, lived long enough to notice it a third time, but probably not, or perhaps not, noticed it 2 times, and then transmitted that knowledge to somebody in his hamlet or her hamlet, and said, keep an eye out for that, right? Keep an eye out, because I think something's going on here. And they did, and they started noticing, this is predictable. This is important, and so we're going to construct something that confirms it, which they did. And why is that important? We can only speculate. But again, I know that a lot of ceremonies, not only in my community, but in ceremonies around the world, indigenous ceremonies, all sorts of ceremonies of all sorts of people, one of the things that they want to confirm is the stability of the universe. And if it keeps happening over and over and over again, there's a comfort in that. It also reflects perhaps the fact that their ceremonies and the lives that they're living are good, that there's an efficacy there proven by the stability of the universe. And I think also perhaps because we do believe in a sky world that is so much a part of our reality that they just wanted to connect to it. They just wanted to share in that celebration of the creation of the universe, right? Whether you call it God, Creator, Kashamnado, Allah, it's just incredible, right? This creation that we've been given, is just mind-blowing, right? So they were astronomers.
And would you say, John, that they didn't, the traditional people back then didn't conceive of the moon as a rock orbiting the Earth? It was like a spiritual being?
Yeah. So generally we think of, some of this is tough to talk about because we don't know how much missionaries affected our ideas about gender. But at least for the last couple of 100 years, we think of the moon as a mother, grandmother, female, and the son as male, father, grandfather. And so, yeah, so it was a part of our lived experience. It was a part of our family, and it was a part of the ongoing lived experience of these Native people. And it's funny you mentioned that about how those old school archaeologists said, well, the Indians are too savage, you know, to have done that. You know, isn't it wonderful how we've been able to preserve this, how now the Ohio History Connection has led this, this long effort to get UNESCO World Heritage inscription on these sites, which puts them on par with all these other sites, Angkor Wat, Colosseum, Parthenon, Machu Picchu, Taj Mahal, Stonehenge, that it acknowledges that we were sophisticated people living sophisticated lives too 2,000 years ago.
And she's not here to say this, so I will add it, but another one of an Indigenous leader, Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee, who's been a big supporter of World Heritage, has said on numerous occasions that she was thrilled to support the World Heritage effort because all of her life she has only ever heard of her ancestors referred to as savages. But now she's having her ancestors referred to as geniuses. And what a sea change that must be for so many Indigenous people, and especially for Indigenous youth.
Sure, absolutely. You know, my grandmother, I was raised primarily by my grandmother who was Potawatomi and my mother who was Potawatomi. And my grandmother used to say, you know, when they dress you up at Thanksgiving as the half-naked savage, you know, I can't tell the school what to do, but I can tell you, take pride in who you are and who your ancestors are and in where you come from and what they accomplished, you know. And so, yeah, it's a huge moment for really Indigenous peoples across America, around the world, really, right? When we have one of these sites that is protected and promoted as an example of just how civilized we were, you know, and perhaps we need to redraw that definition of civilization, right? Because if somebody does that, that's some pretty civilized people in my mind.
Absolutely. So one of the other components of the outstanding universal value that you have to demonstrate to become a World Heritage Site, and we've already talked about sort of the elaborate monumental architecture, the incredible knowledge of geometry and astronomy built into the earthworks. In addition to that, the Hopewell, and we have to emphasize that Hopewell is not the name of an Indian tribe. It is an archaeological name to define people that built earthworks like this and made spear points like this during this particular time in this particular area. So it's not exactly arbitrary, but I mean, archaeologists are focused on material culture, things and architecture, and classifying them and putting them in time. And when people have asked, like, well, what happened to the Hopewell people? Why did they vanish and disappear? It's like, it's exactly similar to asking, what happened to those weird covered wagon people that used to live in Ohio? Or those really strange Model T Ford people, you know, where'd they go? Did they all die out? Did somebody wipe them out? Did the ancient aliens take them away? It's, because that's what archaeologists are talking about, material culture and how it changes. But just because the material culture changes doesn't mean the people change. I mean, it's just the society changes, people invent new things, decide to build architecture in different ways. So the Hopewell episode is just one in a whole sequence of cultures that go back to the Ice Age and extend to the present here in Ohio. But back then, 2,000 years ago, some of you may know Ohio had an advertising slogan many years ago, and they've just revived it, I guess. Ohio, the heart of it all. 2,000 years ago, it was the heart of it all. So this is where Hopewell civilization was thriving 2,000 years ago. in the burial mounds that back in the 1800s were excavated to find loot and treasure in them, and they found like real treasures of knowledge that were in there. There are ceremonial regalia crafted from raw materials that were brought to Ohio from quite literally the ends of the world. So conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico found in Hopewell mounds. Mica from the Carolinas found in Ohio mounds. Copper from southern Canada. And the most far-flung, a black volcanic glass called obsidian. I wish I could show you these actual examples. They look like spear points, but they're like about a foot long. And so they weren't real spear points, they were symbols of spear points. And there were like 100 of those that were broken intentionally, put on an altar with some other burnt offerings, and then a mound built over it. So very important ceremonial. But when I was an undergraduate, this was taught as if it was a trade network. And trade is certainly a part of it. All cultures trade. But if you were trading obsidian from one village to another, you'd run out of obsidian before you got to the Mississippi River. So if you make this as a graph, with this being the quantity of obsidian and this being the distance, you've got tons of it out here where these people actually live, and these people have lots of it, and these people have lots of it. But by the time you get to the Mississippi River, it's gone. And then you keep going, and then suddenly you get a big spike in Ohio. So my interpretation of this, and I'd be interested in what John's reflections would be about this, is that these places were like Mecca or Jerusalem. These were pilgrimage destinations for people from all across America who would bring offerings of special stuff from where they lived, present them at the site, perhaps help construct earthworks, engage in some of the worship, watch the northernmost moon rise, and then go home and maybe take a bride or a husband with them, or maybe they would stay here and intermarry with the people here. But that's what I think is one of the key things about this. That's why the earthworks are so big. The Great Circle, after the Civil War, there was a grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who'd served from Ohio, and there was a big grand reunion at the Great Circle. And a Cincinnati newspaper said 15,000 to 20,000 people gathered in the Great Circle to hear orations from President Rutherford B. Hayes and General James Garfield and William Tecumseh Sherman and others. Did 15,000 to 20,000 indigenous people ever go there 2,000 years ago? Well, if not, why did they go to all the effort to make it so big? And I think it must have been a place where people came from hundreds, thousands of miles away.
Excellent. Yeah. It reflects a lot of travel here. There is also, I think, certainly these have the Newark Earthworks, all the Hopewell era earthworks reflect sacredness and ceremony, and I think more than that in use. I know Indian people today very well, and they don't build stuff they use 2 or 3 times a year. Not with that much effort that was going to take. I think it was being used on a regular basis for all sorts of things, for sport, for births, for naming ceremonies, for vision quests, for economy, for trade, for installation of community leaders, for funerals, for all the things that happen in life. I think that the Octagon and or the Great Circle were probably the first Indian mound mall in the area. I think also, and this precedes these sacred sites, is there's of course Flint Ridge, which is just 15 miles east of 9 miles east of the Newark Earthworks, and it's the best flint in the country. It's not only strong, it's beautiful and easy to work. And I found out, now this is an interesting confession, I found out that there are members from the Pokagon Potawatomi that had been traveling all my life. I'm not a hunter, and I don't need flint. I'm not a ceremonial person, so I don't need flint to start a ceremonial fire. I found out, though, since moving here, there's Pokagon Potawatomi people that have been coming to Flint Ridge forever, right? And so that may have been a nice side excursion, right? Is also to get that flint. But yeah, the waterways, absolutely. We're in the epicenter of resources, a lot of deer, forests, cleared areas, water, which was huge. I have students that ask me also, well, if they're so sophisticated, the Romans built the Appian Way. You guys didn't build any roads. And I say, well, that's a good point, but we didn't need roads. We had the rivers, right? And we built, or Waynabuju, spirit of the creator, who's our guider and trickster, taught us how to make birch bark canoes. And so we traveled all around the continent in our canoes. And we taught the Europeans how to make canoes. So how sophisticated are they? Right? So it's, yeah, so a lot of things going on there and a lot of exciting opportunities for continued indigenous, native and non-native interactions with these spaces now to come in the future.
Well, I do want to leave time for questions. We've gone on a little bit. Let's see. Oh, the last point I want to make is we've talked about these places as being science-oriented and technology-oriented in that sense. This is Barnett Newman, an abstract expressionist painter from America, and he came to these ceremonial earthworks years ago, back in the probably 60s or 50s, and this is from his journal. Walking inside the Fort Ancient and Newark earthworks, one is confounded by a multiplicity of sensations, that here are the greatest works of art on the American continent, that here in the seductive Ohio Valley are perhaps the greatest art monuments in the world. So their art, their science, their religion, they're everything like all at once. And I think that's the last slide. And so if we could take questions now, unless you want to add to that.
No, just a great quote.
Okay, anybody have any particular questions for either of us?
Really quick for the audience, this is a hybrid event. We have quite a few people online, so if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. That way everyone can hear what's asked. We'll start up front.
When you mentioned the students from Indiana, when did that happen? When was that?
That was in the late 70s or the early 80s when Hively and Horn brought their class to Newark. And
Okay.
their paper on it was published in 1982, so it was some years before that.
Okay. And so most of the travel then was done by waterway, not by foot. Is that what you said?
That's what I would presume, right? There's waterways that lead, you have the Ohio River, you have the Muskingum and the Scioto, and, Raccoon Creek is wrapping right around in Newark. There may have been places where they had to portage, but if you can get down to the Ohio River, then you can go up to Pittsburgh, or you can go down to the Mississippi, and you can head south to the Gulf of Mexico. You can head north and go up to Itasca, Minnesota. You can jump onto the Chicago Portage and get to the Great Lakes and get to the Atlantic. And you can go up the Missouri all the way to Yellowstone, where that obsidian came from. So we were world travelers back then.
And were there any human sacrifices done at these sites that, you talked about all kinds of ceremony work. Do we know about any human sacrifices?
Not during the Hopewell. There seem to have been some associated with the Mississippian culture, like at Cahokia, but we don't know of any really definite examples of anything like that during the Hopewell period.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Secondly, you mentioned the changes coming up January 1st relative to the golf course. Is there an estimation of what condition these were in at one time and what condition they are relative to their original build? Are they at 50% of what they used to be, or are they at 100% what they used to be?
You mean, has there been degradation of the earthworks? The National Park Service some years ago did a study of Revolutionary War era embankments, earthworks in Virginia, I think. And they found that once vegetation becomes established on them, whether it's trees or grasses, they're very stable over very long periods of time. So we think from 2,000 years ago to when Europeans first saw them, there hasn't been very much degradation. Over the years, like part of the northern part of the Octagon was being plowed by Europeans. And when you denude it of vegetation and run plows over it, it does deteriorate. The 1/4 or so of the walls probably went from like this high to being this high. And then they were restored when it became the National Guard encampment grounds. They restored them to the original measurements that were provided by some of those early surveyors, the maps I showed you earlier. So a small portion of the Octagon earthworks are restored, the rest of them are pristine and probably aren't much different than they were 1,000 or maybe even 2,000 years ago.
What happens after January 1st?
After January 1st, the golf course will no longer be there, and we're in consultation with indigenous tribes and other stakeholders to talk about what's going to happen at that site next. Personally, I want to see as much of the golf course erased. But for example, the clubhouse has restrooms, it has meeting rooms, it has places where we could have an interpretive center. So as much as I would like to see that removed, that's probably going to be there for a while until we get other money to do something better there. But really, we have made no decisions yet. It's all being discussed. And we're familiar with an example of a Cuyahoga Valley National Park. There was a golf course that was incorporated into that, and they're trying to turn it back into nature. But apparently during the 20s and 30s, herbicides and fungicides, I guess, used a lot of mercury and lead. And so there's severe contamination of some of the soils on that golf course, and we're worried we might have the same thing here. So one of the first things we're going to do is do that environmental testing to see what level of contamination we're having to deal with.
I agree with everything Brad said. The one question that I get often is both the Great Circle and the Octagon have very large trees on them. And I believe that there were ethnobotanists that did studies that indicated that back in the day, 2,000 years ago, there were probably no trees there. And students have asked me, are you going to cut down the trees? And my vote, which is only one small voice, right, is that in the world that I grew up in, those trees are also grandfathers. They're entitled to a life cycle. It's not their fault that they're there, and they are there, and they're living their best lives. And so perhaps as the trees pass, they won't be allowed to other trees spring up, but I'm hopeful that it won't be clear-cut, so that although having been a week ago or so watching the moonrise, it was a little distressing to wait for the moon to get above the trees.
So we are talking about cutting down maybe like 11 or 12 trees to clear up the alignment, but then as John says, not intentionally cut any trees down unless they're sick, let them die naturally, but never replant new ones. So a couple hundred years from now, it'll look like it did 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
Will the Octagon be open for visitors on January 1st?
Yes. I'll be out there. Many of my colleagues will be out there. It's not how my wife envisioned me spending New Year's Day, but it's how I really will love spending New Year's Day.
Question over here.
All right, you talked earlier about certain cultures that choose to build vertically versus cultures that choose to build horizontally. Mm-hmm. Are there other cultures in the world that have chosen a horizontal approach, or is that pretty much an Americas or a North America thing?
There are examples in South America, as the Amazonian rainforest has been denuded. It's revealed earthworks that look surprisingly like Hopewell earthworks, only they're smaller, circles and things. And that seems to be a parallel development, not directly related to what's going on in Ohio. But boy, you put some of those earthworks in Ohio and you'd think, oh yeah, those are Hopewell. But I think that's like the only other thing I know about. Do you know about those, John?
Well, I'm thinking of the Nazca lines.
Yes.
You know, the famous Nazca lines in Chile? Peru?
Yeah, somewhere in South Peru, maybe.
Peru. Yeah, that are incredible, and they are also inscribed, really complex, sophisticated, huge designs inscribed on the earth, but you know, there's no height at all to them, right?
They're just engraved in the ground, basically.
Yeah.
Did the soil all come from the moat?
No. In fact, we know they use different kinds of soil, and the walls at the Great Circle are deeper than the moat is deep. So some of the dirt, I mean, just in terms of economy, was probably used. But it looks like the outside of the earthwork is made out of dark brown soil, and the inside is made out of bright yellow-brown soil. And that seems very intentional. And that sort of color distinction has also been found at the Hopeton earthworks in Chillicothe. So they're making intentional choices about good soils that will endure, you know, for centuries or millennia, that will, not like a pile of sand that will just wash away, but also the different colors, I think, have a significance, and I don't know what that would be.
And I've been told that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that oftentimes if I have students say, well, how can you tell a mound from, you know, somebody was building a foundation, you know, for their basement and they piled up some dirt. And I've been told that if you do a core sample, it'll be layers of earth if it's a mound, and it'll just be haphazardly piled up dirt if it's just, you know, whatever, right? And so it's an engineering feat. And the clay, I like to think, you mentioned there's clay on the inside at the Great Circle. And that yellowish clay, I like to think perhaps at sunrise that it would have created a ring of light, of brightness that would have really celebrated the breaking of the day, and it would have really make it pop. So, you know, they were artists too.
Just thinking about the landscape, the original landscape back thousands of years ago, was there fire used to keep it clear, to keep the trees away? I've read that different prairies, for different agricultural reasons, fire was used by Native peoples a lot for clearance.
Yes, and I highly recommend the book 1491 that talks about indigenous people in America before that. But yeah, in 1992, we excavated a trench through the Great Circle and found at the bottom the intact soil surface. And the soil scientist that I was working with from Denison was looking at that and says, Brad, that's not a forest soil profile, that's a prairie soil profile. And I'm like, oh no, 2,000 years ago, the climate's the same, it should have been a forest. But yes, you're exactly right. Indigenous people were managing the environment for thousands of years. So this wasn't a wilderness when Europeans got here. It was in many ways a managed environment. They clear areas of trees and create the prairie, because a forest doesn't have very many deer in it, but a forest with lots of prairie patches has lots of deer in it.
Yeah, and one thing that I had another person from the absentee Shawnee tribe who came to visit mentioned to me is that, as Brad says, the deer, you know, deer are plentiful in Licking County, right? It's the most deer harvested in the deer hunts every year. And, you know, Salt Lake's why it's called Licking County. And this absentee Shawnee friend of mine said, well, if you have a prairie with a tree line, that's their favorite place to hang out. They love to hang out at the tree lines. And so, you know, it's, I wanted to mention one other thing, is about why don't we have more stories You know, okay, Professor Lowe, you're talking about this oral transmission of knowledge, and you're going on and on about this, but you just also admitted that, you know, we don't have stories about this place. Well, there's a couple of aspects to that. One is throughout the continent, there was like a 90% die-off of indigenous people, primarily from disease. And so imagine how much knowledge we would lose if 90% of all of us were gone. You know, we'd be quite hobbled, right? Because I don't know how to square a circle and never will. And but also the other thing that, and this is just pure speculation, is that the historical reports, which always have to be critically analyzed, you know, the first settlers, colonists, whatever, non-native people coming to this area, asked the Shawnee, are these your mounds? Do you know anything about these mounds? And the reported answer was no. We take care of them, but the ancestors built them. We don't really use them anymore. They may not use them anymore, but I question whether, one, the accuracy of that reporting, because there was definitely a political agenda to remove Indians, which they did, from most of the East United States to west of the Mississippi. I don't think they wanted to connect indigenous peoples to anything of significance, and any land claims or their, you know, possessory or emotional connection to the place, I think they just dismissed. They didn't write that into the history. Now, if you ask the Shawnee, they don't have those stories particularly, but that's been 200, 250 years ago. And through boarding schools, through missionaries, through government policy, all of that knowledge has been lost. So we're lucky that we have as many stories that we do. So, and hopefully we're going to build more stories in the future for next generations.
Thanks for this. The Hopewell culture, how does it fit in with the Adena and the Fort Ancient and maybe some others that I don't remember, of mound building groups, and just
Sure.
a simple timeline?
Yeah, the whole sequence in Ohio starts with what are called Paleo-Indians, the most ancient people we know of. And in Ohio, the oldest evidence goes back to about 13,000 years ago, but we know from sites in Pennsylvania and now in New Mexico, people have been here for much longer than that, maybe as much as 23,000 years ago. And then we have the Archaic period, which are still hunting and gathering peoples. That's after the end of the Ice Age for about 4,000 or 5,000 years. And they're hunting and gathering peoples, you know, just doing the things hunter-gatherers do in the rich environment of Ohio. And then at about 300-400 BC, you have the Adena, the first mound building cultures in Ohio. They become the Hopewell, or at least some branch of them becomes the Hopewell. Because for some time, the Adena are in southeastern Ohio doing their own thing, while the Hopewell are doing their things in central and southern Ohio. And then the Hopewell ends at about AD 400, and you've got what are called the late woodland cultures that are living in larger villages, growing corn, hunting with bows and arrows, which the Hopewell and previous people didn't have. And then they sort of turn into the Fort Ancient culture, at least in southern Ohio. There's much more diversification in the period after about 1000 AD. Southern Ohio is the Fort Ancient. Northern Ohio, you've got the Sandusky culture and other cultures, but they're living in large villages. And the best example is Sunwatch Village in Dayton. I mean, you go there and it's a Fort Ancient village that's been excavated and restored on the foundations. You can go into the houses and see the palisade wall around it. It's a wonderful, it's like colonial Williamsburg for indigenous Ohio. Sunwatch Village, and it's in Dayton. And it's Sunwatch is all one word run together.
Where did the Serpent Mound go? It's later.
Serpent Mound was built by the same people that built Sunwatch Village. It's Fort Ancient, as well as Licking County has its own effigy mound. But that also dates to this 1,000 years ago, the Fort Ancient culture. So
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, if we want to visit the Newark Earthworks, what are your? Are there any activities or events, or does the OSU Newark Earthworks Center offer educational tours? How would you recommend people get the most out of visiting this area?
Well, there are tours. I do a First Friday tour, but those are over for the season now. But they'll be starting up again in April. So the first Friday of every month between April and November. I give free First Friday tours, but the staff there also will do tours occasionally. I mean, I think if you call them, you can arrange to have a tour. Soon we'll be doing tours at the Octagon Earthworks. And there's tours at Fort Ancient Earthworks. And the staff at Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, if you go to Mound City, which is their headquarters, you'll get tours there too.
Yeah, the part of it's the National Park Service, which have great tours, and Ohio History Connection is developing good tours. Kudos to Brad for doing those Friday tours when the weather complies. And there's also Sarah Hinkleman is her name, and if you come close to spelling it like it sounds, you can Google her and find out. She's the site manager at the Great Circle, and as I understand it, will become the site manager for the Octagon too, perhaps. There is a small museum at the Great Circle. That will need to be torn down, unfortunately, because it blocks the eastern door. So it is like in the perfect wrong spot. So it'll probably have to go, but that's not as big. I'm like Brad, I'm a supporter. I don't like the clubhouse because it's got a little corner of it that infringes on the Octagon, but with real estate prices now, that's what, $400,000, $500,000 building. Let's take a pause before we tear it down, right? And we have, in fact, an international convention coming in March with the, interestingly enough, the Asian Studies programs here at Ohio State is hosting them, and they're coming from around the world, and some of them are making the trip to the Great Circle and the Octagon, and we're gonna do a lot, and thankfully, because we never can count on the weather here in Ohio, in March, we had the clubhouse, which will provide nice accommodations. And so just one last thing, my memories of the golf course are mixed. When the elders came down, Pokagon elders, they gave all of the elders golf carts, which was really nice of them to do that. And they didn't have to, but they did, and it allowed for a great experience for the elders to be able to zip around. Many of them had never been in a golf cart before, and that was obvious. But they also, have limited our access, really made it difficult at times for access, particularly once this whole litigation thing started. It got, rather nasty. But early on, I've been here 12 years, early on, we were told, well, there's four weekends a year. One of them is during the Masters tournament. So, so they want to be inside watching and the TV. So that's okay to use that Sunday. But they also told me that, well, you can bring your students on Mondays because that's when we put the herbicide down. And so we don't allow golfing. And it's like, what the heck? So I didn't bring any students on that offer.
Dr. John Lau and Dr. Brad Lepper, thank you so much for tonight's discussion. This is wonderful.
Thank you very much. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, I got to finish my language lesson. So we say.